Mini episode 548 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by First Down Scouting, delivering the most thorough scouting service available, uncovering the NFL stars of tomorrow. Follow them on the web at the number 1 stdownscouting.com.
The FDH Lounge. You want to schedule your life around it.
30 seconds.
In front of all these people, you're going to pull out a gun and you're going to shoot an unarmed man.
20 seconds.
So what are you going to do?
10.
Welcome to the FDH Lounge and the Justified episode recap.
It was justified.
With your original dignitaries,
Fire in the hole!
Rick Morris and Jason Jones.
You got ice cold water running through your veins.
Breaking down each Justified episode the moment they've concluded.
Did you take a peek inside the soul of Raymond Newton?
I'm just going to let that old dog lie.
Real-time reactions. Next level analysis.
You seem to be harboring a bit of hostility there, brother.
So I've been told.
And now, your dignitaries.
Well, I believe we can take her from here.
Welcome, everyone, to mini episode number 548 of the FDH Lounge. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris. I have with me FDH Senior Editor Jason Jones. We are, of course, also in the course of these co-branded Justified post-show segments, doing this under the banner of NotJustAnotherTVSite.com, where I am the resident Justified columnist. You can also check out my scribblings over there on Better Call Saul, on House of Cards, and now with Mad Men starting up. So you can check that out. We've got some audio shows going for Mad Men as well. Not exactly like this one, but doing some audio coverage for that as well. Of course, Jason and I in our second year of covering Justified for the FDH Lounge. And after tonight, we have only one episode to go in the entire history of the show. I think it's been 4 episodes in a row now that have really kind of built up to this huge climax. And another really, really big one tonight. I know Jason Jones was probably having trouble catching his breath throughout it, as I was. We'll bring him in now and get his thoughts. Jason, this is another one of these ones where I guess I don't even know where to start tonight, so I will defer to whatever your instinct is.
Well, my first thought is expectations are a son of a gun, because I got about halfway through this episode and thought, well, if it's going to live up to the previous 2 or 3, they better give me something soon. So it's lovely that Breaking Bad, by some extension, has created this expectation. When a great quality show like Justified is winding down, they've got to really bring it down the stretch. So it was what it was. It was exciting. It was a typical penultimate episode. It's just that it was justified and had some really good moments, and some moments that left me kind of questioning how it's possible, unless they do a double, feature situation next week, how they could possibly tie everything together in an hour or an hour and change next week.
I got to think there's going to be a run over, and that may certainly affect when we get the thing started. If it turns out to be a significant run over, I think it'll be unavoidable. We can't very well start this before the show, and indeed the series has ended. But it's a situation where when you look at it, I think there were a lot of expectations subverted tonight through the course of the show, how it was going along. I agree with you. The first part of it there, at no point was I bored. But with all of the action happening out in the woods, I kept waiting for the shoe to drop, and it did kind of build from there, maybe a little bit slowly. But once you start getting to the segment when Bob interjects himself into the situation, then you're looking at gunfire, and things really, really picked up as it went along. Nice little cliffhanger that they had there as well, too, where you knew that there was some gunfire between Boyd and Bob, and that never got referred to again until Boyd drops the whole thing there with Raylan along the lines of, oh, by the way, I shot Bob, and he might be bleeding out down there. So an interesting situation there. When I speak of the expectations being subverted through the course of the show, I think first and foremost, I would say the whole subplot with AUSA Vasquez, and we talked about it last week, he's back in his old mode of being on the warpath about all things Raylan, and he manages to get a bolo put out on Raven. He's going to try and file an indictment, whatever, and Raylan knows that he's a marked man. He doesn't know how bad it is, but he knows he's a marked man at that point, and yet he brings in Bob there at the end. Just seeing Raylan once again in civilization after an entire episode of basically being out in the woods, out on the hall, I didn't think we'd see Raylan back in civilization until the very end of this thing. So that really subverted my expectations, I have to say. And then, of course, he gets placed under arrest at the end of the episode.
No, that's a big, big moment for me, specifically because I get the feeling that, intentionally so, this Raylan in the Hills storyline or feature is really a nice throwback to previous seasons. I want to say it was season 1, maybe, that's referenced with the mountain guy talking about when he was locked up in that metal barn with Boyd. So it was a nice full circle moment. I was perfectly content to, as you mentioned, just ride out whatever this is tonight, see Raylan out in the woods, and then not see Raylan come back to civilization until, dare I say, high noon at the OK Corral when this whole thing comes to a head. So that was a little surprising that we saw. And, the moment he got in the car with Bob and they're racing to get Bob to some help, first thought that entered my mind was Raylan better drop him and bolt, because if he doesn't, there's going to be people waiting to take him in, and that will thus complicate the situation. Now, all we know is that he had guns on him. In the promo there, we saw that he's going to be out and doing what Raylan does in that final episode. So I'm a little more intrigued than I probably should be on just how long of a turnaround it's going to be before he is either just walks away from the guys with their guns on him, or if he has to go through the whole situation and maybe Art or somebody else pulls a string to get him out. But that was absolutely a big, let's call it a big, small moment. It's not a huge thing in the evolution of this season. But in that moment, it was very shocking, and I was surprised they went that way.
I was as well, and I think that right there kind of bodes for a long overrun next week, I would tend to think, because within the confines of a 1-hour show, without rushing anything, I don't see any way for Art to get his bacon out of this situation long enough for him to get into the field. And one wonders, again, is it going to be a temporary type matter of where maybe Vasquez and everybody even signs off on the prospect of you complete this mission and then you turn in your badge for good? I could see it being a situation like that, but legally I don't know how it would go, especially with Vasquez turning loose the dogs of war legally on him here at this point. And also, I'm sure you caught this as well, and I'm sure that you, watching it separately out there in the state of Colorado, I'm sure perked up at this. As Win Duffy is getting his getaway kit from his contact, presumably in the Dixie Mafia, he throws in the request for a topographical map of Kentucky. We got one more wild card entering this chase next week, Jason.
Well, two things with that come to mind. The first was when he's talking to Vasquez and says, he's trying to just get out of the situation. And he says that Avery, Boyd, and Raylan are all going to converge, and I want no part of that. And then shortly thereafter, for him to ask for a topographical map, intriguing doesn't quite cover it. If Raylan driving Bob and getting drawn on was kind of a big moment, that was the sit up in your seat and pick your jaw up off the floor sort of moment, for me at least, as far as what that means for next week. Where does Win Duffy come into this? Because in this whole last season, I've been trying to visualize who walks off into the sunset. And at one point, you and I discussed maybe it's Ava. Maybe this is actually a story where Ava comes out on top. Maybe it's Win Duffy. I don't know. And that's the beauty of this, is that we know that multiple powers are going to converge and it's going to be atomic, at least I hope. And now we're adding Win Duffy to that equation, which I don't want to say completely changes it, but does make it even more interesting.
It does, and it would be poetic. You have to believe at this point, to the extent that we can forecast anybody's demise next week, the notion of Win Duffy being a guy who comes out on top in this, when again, he's been a guy who is, I would never say marginal to the story the whole way through, but you've got Raylan, you've got Boyd, you've got Ava. They've been the front burner characters start to finish on this thing. And Win Duffy is somewhere down on that next tier, somewhere down on there. I'm not even going to say at the front of that next tier. When you look at the Marshalls, when you look at Raylan's father, as long as he was alive. So to have him be this big figure in the end, I just don't see it. It would be kind of poetic in terms of, we talked about it last week, right? How did he make it out of that Winnebago alive? The whole thing, after a nuclear war, there will still be cockroaches, ho-hos, and Win Duffy. But it would be kind of poetic if he goes for the big score, and it just proves to be one time too many. He probably thinks he's bulletproof right now. Newsflash, he ain't.
No, you bring up a great point. It would be strange. It would fly in the face of what we would expect. Win Duffy, at some point, we have to believe, if we're objective about it, is going to get what's coming to him at some point before the credits roll next week. The bulletproof thing, the invincible complex, absolutely. I think that all plays into ultimately a Win Duffy demise. The thing is, I'm just not willing to, let's say, mark anybody off with 10 just yet, because I don't know what's going to happen. I keep trying to rack my brain and make a prediction, and I got nothing. So there's the only reason to even mention Win Duffy walking away is just because I'm not ruling anything out. But to your point, absolutely, if I'm putting money on it, it's your way is a lot more likely than mine. But that's what we're going to have to wait and see. And if I could, real quick, I don't want to miss out on this. Going back to Vasquez.
Yeah.
I hope he in some way kind of gets something. I hope he finds some negativity in this. I'm not saying he needs to get shot or anything, but I would even love to see a scenario where Raylan is lauded in some way, and then maybe some of the higher ups admonish Vasquez for interfering with, a case that turned out perfectly fine despite his interference. Because Vasquez, he's had some nice lucid moments, but for the most part, he has been a son of a gun and a thorn in everyone's side for the majority of the series.
He has been. The times when he's been nicer to Raylan have seemed kind of jarring. Certainly he was in the aftermath of taking down Theo Tonin, just because that was a bright spot for the record of everybody that was involved in it. This is more Vasquez as we've come to know him over a period of time, and raging at all of the Marshalls here. They, again, closed ranks behind Raylan tonight. I was a little bit kind of vague on what the legal maneuver was that they had done. They had put out some kind of, I guess, protection order for Raylan while he was out there, which, again, Vasquez was able to avoid fairly quickly and easily. So it shows that, again, even after all of this, there's a reservoir of respect and affection from, we saw Tim and Art tonight. Didn't see Rachel. Presumably she's still going on the case as well here. You got to think if anything bad happens to Vasquez, it's probably along those lines. He had kind of raged a couple of episodes back about what this was doing to the career of both him and Rachel, the whole thing of using Ava as the confidential informant, and then she ends up going on the run with the 10 mil. So he seems to be trying to free himself of this big stink bomb that could really tarnish his career. And I think if you're wishing for something ill to happen to him, Jason, my guess is it's right there in front of you. It's that despite his best efforts to make Raylan and everyone else around him a scapegoat, that it's not going to work.
Yeah, and that's really it. I'm sure the fan fiction people out there just want a big bloodbath, but the more realistic thing is that it would be administrative, if anything at all.
Probably. You would have to think so, and we haven't seen much in terms of the bureaucracy of this show and the federal government over a period of time. It gets alluded to here and there, but for Vasquez to have put it out there, you have to believe that that may come back into play. As far as how everything went with Ava, her being on the run through the course of the show tonight, it was very, very interesting that she was the one, by dint perhaps of being married to one Crowder and subsequently engaged to another, who had a much clearer idea of what was happening than good old Uncle Zach Randolph, because she knew Boyd would be out. She knew he was coming after. I'm going to beat that into the ground. Zach Randolph using his post moves out in the woods tonight, but you got to think that, again, the very end there with Boyd getting the better of Uncle Zach, you got to think that was poetic justice, because the old guy, I think, underestimated him after getting the better of him down in the mines. And that's you get what you bargained for if you underestimate Boyd Crowder. We know that at this point.
Yeah. There's sometimes I wish we had a video feed for while we're watching this that we can put on the website. Because, first thought, before I get to Zachariah's numb brain, Ava knew. Ava knew like we knew, almost. And in that moment when she's sort of freaking out, saying, we don't know what the deal is with Boyd, and Zachariah is like, hey, everything's fine. The little voice in my head pulled off a perfect Bane impression from The Dark Knight Rises when the Commissioner Gordon floats away, and he goes, well, did you bring the body? Unless I see Boyd Crowder's dead body in a body bag and a tag on his toe, I'm not going to believe that he's dead, just like Ava didn't believe that he was dead, and therefore right all along. Now, moving on to Zachariah, yes, again, maybe we've just seen enough of Boyd in action to know that when that doorknob turned and Zachariah pulled up his shotgun, I'm thinking, if you shoot the door before the door opens, you're an idiot, which is exactly what he did. And then, sure enough, like an idiot, walks out into the darkness, and that was it. I didn't even need to see the rest of the scene to know that was it. Now, the interesting twist, of course, is that this was the part where Zachariah thought he was going to take Boyd Crowder to hell with him, but nay. I don't know how many times I have to say this to TV characters, and of course it's fictional, so we take it with a grain of salt. How many times are you going to tell the guy you're trying to kill him that you're going to kill him and thus give him a few minutes to get away? It was absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
He had him dead to rights and had to be cocky about it.
Well, yeah, even on this show, once in a while you tend to get characters going all Bond villain of, let me tell you what kind of horrible death I have planned for you, Mr. Bond. You do get that once in a while on the show. It's interesting all the places that the mind can go. The interesting thing is I'm watching as we speak right now here in real time after the episode, the immediate replay on FX, of where Ava has just learned over that radio that Boyd is out there. It's so funny. You were thinking in terms of Bane. The mind can go many different ways. Like, for example, you know what I was thinking as I was watching this a little bit too? I'm more thinking of like a slasher movie, a horror movie. Oh, my God, he's out there. He's coming for me. Because that's what it is. Whatever the monster is in a slasher film, and ultimately, really any slasher film, because plot-wise, you've seen one, you've seen them all. This is basically the template right here. Boyd is in the woods after her. Yeah, he's got a gun, not a chainsaw, but I mean, it's all kind of the same thing, isn't it? They're working off the same template at this point.
Funny thing is, you visualize Boyd's hair, Boyd's white-collared shirt button all the way to the top, and he's just walking. Walking is not even covered in. He's strolling through the woods with a gun in one hand. And off in the distance, you see the nice, cute, blonde Ava Crowder, who is frantically running and tripping over tree roots, and eventually he's just going to catch her, and that's the end of that. And it, absolutely, it looks like something straight out of a slasher movie. So yeah, it's interesting to see where the brain goes. But I absolutely got that sense that no matter how far she goes or how fast she goes, she's not getting away. You know, I think at some point we might have entertained the idea that Ava Crowder walks off into the sunset. But unless somebody, whether it be Avery, Markham, or Raylan gets to Boyd first, at this point I don't think she's getting away. Just like I don't think the blonde girl running away from Jason through the woods is getting away.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities there when you look at how it went. And ultimately, Ava did make the smart move in running, even though in the end, first she runs into Bob and then kind of gets sidetracked there, manages to somehow or another rip herself out of that crummy little gremlin that she's handcuffed to. I'm just surprised it took that much effort for her to free herself from the handcuffs there, given that she was probably attached to a piece of what I'm guessing is nothing more than Bondo in that car. But she gets away when she hears the gunshots, and Bob is basically engaged in the gunfight with Boyd out in the woods there. So she gets away, subsequently gets brought in by a couple of cops. I had a weird vibe about the police that got to her there. Didn't immediately put two and two together on that. I don't know if you did. They're like, oh, these are the ones that Avery owns. And then that's where it started to get interesting once it became very, very clear. I won't even say once the mind made that connection, because I'd be lying. The mind made that connection after it was made explicit on screen.
Well, the funny thing there is talking about different versions of the experience. When Ava is handcuffed to the car and Bob goes away, I'm looking right at it, not even like paying attention to the scene, just looking at what she's attached to, and I actually said out loud, "Oh, come on, Ava, it's a gremlin. Just rip it off."
Right.
But back to the cop thing. The fact that they were right on top of her, I was under the impression, at least in that fraction of a second, that this was one of the various manhunts that was referred to earlier back at Marshall headquarters. And then the second that they just handcuffed her real quick and the reaction the guy got from the money in the bag, I'm not going to say that I predicted it, but when they revealed themselves to be the guys in Avery Markham's pocket, I wasn't surprised in the least. And I think that's different than being able to say that I read it out. I just wasn't surprised.
Well, the funny thing is the showrunner, Graham Yost, the executive producers with him, Tim Oliphant on down, they operate almost on the same level, if you will. Certainly not in terms of morality, but in terms of the Boyd Crowder mentality, there are no loose ends. We saw the dirty cops there at the jail in the previous episode. One of them gives the stink eye to Raylan as he is leading Carl away. You know that's going to go somewhere, or leading Earl away. I guess I get those two interchangeable hill jacks confused, quite frankly. But, you have that situation. Really, Boyd and Zach Randolph did it with each other. Each of them at one point in time. Remember, Boyd thought that Zach died down in the mines. He couldn't have possibly made it out of there. He lived to see it. Of course, Zach underestimated Boyd, didn't think he'd be after him tonight. Nobody seems to learn that lesson here, that in the universe that is Justified, Harlan County, and this show, there are no loose ends. And you said it before with Boyd, but it really holds true for anybody. Assume that nobody's dead until you see the body. And again, the writers don't leave loose ends. That leads us to another point here that I have about Boyd, and this being a point that I've been making throughout the season. You look at the way that he murdered Dewey Crow in the season opener this year. And I've alluded before, and I'll be very, very interesting to talk to our friend, fellow FDH Lounge dignitary Ken Detweiler, who's a big fan of the show, and who is a big Boyd Crowder sympathizer. And this is a thing where I think as you've been going through this season, to me it gets to be harder and harder and harder to sympathize with Boyd at all. You look at a situation tonight where Yeah, the guy is basically Boyd's hostage, but, you know, at one point the ice kind of gets broken and they're kind of laughing about stuff, and it's clear that this guy, on some kind of level, as a lot of the humble folks in the backwoods do, if not directly looks up to Boyd. Maybe he doesn't approve of every last thing he does, but again, that whole thing tonight about the ballad of Boyd Crowder, you know, at least recognizes that he's a modern-day legend. And it seemed like Boyd really had to psych himself up there at the end to shoot the guy. But he did. He got to a point where he just murdered the guy in cold blood. And, yeah, there's the thing about no loose ends, whatever. But it all depends on the circumstance of the individual involved. I think that, again, even if I were facing the gravest of legal jeopardy, I wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do that. Most people we know wouldn't do that. Boyd Crowder in that moment, he already was a guy that I couldn't sympathize with anymore because of a lot of the stuff he's done, especially this season. But that, to me, tonight, I mean, if that wasn't the last straw for people who were rooting for Boyd Crowder, then I don't think there is such a thing as a last straw.
Well, the funny thing is, and I say this with some hesitation because I have not had a chance to have a conversation with Ken about his view on Boyd. But I would say this. I think you're absolutely right. I think this season was a journey to discover exactly where or when you stop being a Boyd sympathizer. I think for the majority of the series, he's been a great anti-hero. I would put him up against arguably the best that TV has to offer in that category. He's a phenomenal character. But at this point, if you're still sticking up for Boyd Crowder, you are not a Boyd sympathizer, you are a Boyd apologist. Because he's now done a handful of things this season that you really can't condone on any level. And it started with Dewey, and now most recently the guy in the truck whose name I missed along the way. There was something there, and whether he needed to buck himself up or he was just building to that, I don't know. But I'm not saying I dislike him or my affection for him is deteriorating, but Boyd is firmly supplanting himself as the villain of all villains in this story we're being told. So anybody who's still sort of Team Boyd, I don't see it. Now, you want to go back and you want to talk about season 2 or throw in the Dairy Queen or what he did to the aristocracy of Harlan County. There are moments where you can go back and say, we're really rooting for this guy. Now is not that time, though.
You know what I would make the comparison to, and I don't know if you would find any validity in this or not, what's also fresh in my mind at this very moment in terms of finales, just having covered the season finale for Better Call Saul, and in terms of that going through and thinking about the ways that they leveraged what happened on Breaking Bad and the trajectory of that series, I would compare this with what happened with Walter White. And the last we talked, you had made it almost to the end of Breaking Bad, so you're far enough along to understand the point that I'm trying to make, because when you look at the part of the series where it's Walt against Tuco, where it's Walt against Gus, Walt was arguably, and I think to most people, and even myself, I was never a Walt apologist, but you know what? He was the lesser of two evils a good chunk of the way in terms of the folks he was up against. You get to season 5, he's the bad guy. There's no question about it. The whole cliche that Vince Gilligan put out there about we're going to take him from Mr. Chips to Scarface. Yeah, once he's Scarface, it's hard to be Team Walt. I would say in the last episode, some of the redemptive things that were, even in a backhanded way, trying to be done, you could almost kind of get behind once he had paid the price and once you knew he was going to pay more of a price. That's where Walt was, and that's how I see Boyd now. There's no Mags Bennett that he's going up against. There's no Quarles that he's going up against, where he clearly was painted as the lesser of two evils, and we clearly were meant to root for him against Quarles. There's no such situation like that right now, because you do have Avery, but you look at it now like, okay, well, they're both scumbags. It's not like it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. You can root for Raylan and the Marshalls to take down both of them. So Do you see any kind of similarity as I do when you look at the progression of this thing, of Boyd becoming completely unsympathetic in the final chapters like Walt White?
Yeah, absolutely. And although I haven't got to this backhanded, redeemable qualities or whatever just yet, it's going to be 2017 before I officially finish Breaking Bad. But ironically, another Batman reference comes to mind, and that is either you become the hero or you stick around long enough to see yourself become the villain, or however that quote goes. And that's just simply what it is for me. In the beginning, I didn't like Boyd. First half of first season, didn't like him. By the time season 2 gets rolling, you start to root for the guy, and it becomes a situation where you're almost rooting for Boyd unless it's a Boyd v. Raylan situation, and then most people are going to side with Raylan. There are moments where you get drawn into this whole Bonnie and Clyde thing that we sat through for about 2.5 seasons. And it's alluring. It's an interesting dynamic. But in the end, you're absolutely right. Boyd has officially become the villain. He's become the guy, I would argue even more so than Avery Markham, that needs to be put down. And at this point, I cannot fathom an ending to the show that doesn't end with the death of Boyd Crowder. That's somewhere along the way next week. Maybe we get that standoff we've been wanting, and Raylan's the one that has to put him down. And then the Marshal Service does what they do to get Markham in custody. But somewhere along the line, it stopped being about an anti-hero that was fun to watch, and now he is the bad guy. And whether you realize it or not, I think subconsciously every single viewer has got to be keeping track of the clock until the point that Boyd is no longer a part of the picture. And Boyd in a jail cell, I just can't see that being the ending.
Well, the FDH Lounge being as diverse as it is, I'm going to throw in one more thing here. We've been going all over the spectrum tonight to kind of make comparisons to what we saw in this episode and what they seem to be borrowing from. I'm not going to say they were borrowing in this arena, although maybe they were. I've referenced this before, that there are some long-time figures in the world of pro wrestling that have seen a lot of similarities as far as how Justified gets booked, if you want to use the terminology there. And in terms of with the Lounge doing this ongoing series that I've got going with our fellow FDH Lounge dignitary Kyle Ross, looking at the history of the Royal Rumble and going back through right now in the 90s, what comes to my mind is the face-heel dynamic, as I would call it. And that being, coming into this year, you've got Raylan who, okay, a little bit of an anti-hero, but basically in the wrestling terminology, he's your face. You've got Boyd, who coming into this season, I think, was certainly more of what you would call a tweener than a full-out bad guy. And if you want to have the big money match, really the series finale, if you want to take my ludicrous parallel here and take it all the way, that this is WrestleMania next week, you need to have, if Boyd is going to die, you have to have a crystal clear face-heel dynamic. So to me, that's what this season has been about, among other things here. Or I said that, Boyd sickened me tonight by, killing that guy in cold blood, the Dewey Crow thing at the beginning of the season where he decided to shoot first and ask questions later. He wasn't sure that Dewey was a confidential informant, but their past history together meant nothing. He wasn't going to take any changes. To me, this is making sure that when and if Boyd dies, and that's where I'm going to put my money, that ends up being a satisfying conclusion to people who feel like Boyd has really earned it. Do you kind of agree that that's been the kind of direction?
Without hesitation. Also, just a side note, I do hope that eventually when the series is over that the FDH breakdown finds its way into the viewers of the writer's room for this show, because whether you think it's overdoing it or underdoing it, I don't know. I am absolutely positive there's somebody in the writer's room who's absolutely ripping off pro wrestling booking, period. So
interesting.
The setup you just laid out makes so much sense that it's almost impossible not to think that's the way it went down. And that is, we're experiencing Boyd. Just like Breaking Bad and Mad Men and some of these other shows that are just remarkably followed. It is still just a snapshot of a story. We are experiencing a story unfold. And we've experienced Boyd Crowder highs and lows. Whether you identify with him or not, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, this season, more so than any other character, you are seeing the slight regression of Boyd Crowder going back to being the bad guy he started out to be during the pilot episode. Now, whether that speaks to the journey or not, I don't know. But the big point here is, I think you're right. I think we had to see Raylan after the Theo Tonin thing. He had to work his way back to being the good guy or the face. And Boyd had to work his way back to being the heel. Therefore, when this thing goes down, there is a sense of an absolute value to it, that there is no blurring the lines. There is a bad guy and there is a good guy, and in the end, one of them is going to win and one of them is going to lose. And I think whether the writers in the room felt that was necessary to go out and do, or it just happened organically, that's what happened. End of discussion. That is exactly what happened, and it had to happen to make next week's episode everything I think we hope it's going to be.
Well, as one of those people that I think is in that rather sizable part of the Venn diagram that overlaps Justified and pro wrestling, I've told the story on the show previously. Listening to this podcast done by Wes Thornton, who he's a guy in his 80s, but he's still very active. This is a guy that's done it all in the sport. He was a wrestler, sport with air quotes, by the way, before I get any hate mail or anything like that. Sport with air quotes. But he's been a wrestler, he's been a promoter, he's been a broadcaster, all this kind of stuff. He's been there, done that, whatever. He does this podcast now, and I was tuning in to listen to him talk something about wrestling, but he does like a side note there with a couple of the guys on his show. He's like, "Did any of you guys catch Justified this week?" And they were talking about it a little bit. And this was mid-season 4. This is Raylan's living in above the bar, and he's having his troubles. The woman steals. I think this is when the barmaid stole his money, the one that he thought was his girlfriend. She went on the run, and he goes, "They really know how to put heat on the baby face." I love that, because I love whenever people take wrestling terminology and use it in real life. I use kayfabe a lot, if for no other reason than just to kind of flummox my dad whenever I do that. But it is very interesting. So that's one more parallel that we've drawn to other worlds tonight to try to explain what we've seen. I think the only real element that we haven't gotten much into tonight was Avery, and that being we start this thing out with that interesting kind of monologue to a dead person, if you will. He's there in the morgue with quote-unquote Catherine at that point, vows that he's going to get Wynn Duffy. So, again, the show leaves no loose ends. We do know for a fact, from him having said that, he will cross paths with Wynn Duffy next week. Chances are that's not going to go so good for Wynn, I got to say. But in the end there, even if it was under duress, Loretta ends up swinging around to his side once her boyfriend/ex-boyfriend/hired gun or whatever gets taken out by Avery and Boone. So, again, if I was Avery, I wouldn't be trusting her completely at this point, since she did agree to this under duress. But for the person that is as close as we've seen to any kind of a protege/daughter figure /whatever to Raylan through the course of the series, to end up aligning with one of the two big bads going into the last episode, again, it's as we've been saying the whole year, it's not just Raylan and Boyd. This is, to use one more wrestling term, it's the three-way dance all the way to the end, because you got the arrows pointing both ways between Raylan and Boyd and Avery and Raylan. And that's just what adds to the intrigue. They got to pull it off. It's a complicated dynamic to do, even with a run over next week. That's a lot of stuff to fit into one episode. But the Avery stuff is the wild card in this, as we said earlier, with the Wynn Duffy stuff.
Yeah, and the Avery had a couple big scenes today, and the first one not being that great, just from an acting perspective, there's very few people that would be able to pull that off the scene with Catherine's body, and then the way he's able to sort of toe that line between fury and benevolence when talking to Ms. McCready. So I'll take your idea and take it a step further and just suggest there's got to be an un-Tarantino way to do it. But the more we step back from this, the more it feels like it's going to be something straight out of Reservoir Dogs, where you've got Boyd and Raylan focused on each other. Then Avery's going to come in the mix after Win Duffy. And then Raylan's going to see that now Loretta's involved. And there's revenge for Catherine, and there's the thing with Boone. And I'm saying, yes, it is essentially Raylan, Boyd, Avery. But it seems to me that you can connect the dots to upwards of 10 other people. And just at the end, it comes down to what they're going to choose to do. I think ultimately, as long as good or evil wins, and I think we all are leaning one way if we're talking about Raylan and Boyd, that's fine, and I think we can be okay with that. The question for me is, what does the rest of the fallout look like? What happens to Win? Is Boone going to have his big John Wayne moment? Where's Loretta fit into the mix? How is Raylan's relationship there going to be affected in the future? So it is going to come down to this three-way battle, but I think there's going to be collateral damage that's going to be big.
Here's my guess in this, because we did see from the promo next week, there is going to be that literal Wild West moment between Boyd and Raylan. My guess is, from off camera, before they get a chance to draw, because, again, that looks ominous. It looks like Boone at this point is a faster draw than Raylan. I'm just going to go out on a big limb. Loretta's off camera with a gun. She shoots him in the head before he gets a chance to draw. Basically saves Raylan's life. That would be shades of what happened when the waitress saved him season 4, the barmaid in that aforementioned bar, when you had Quarles that had that holster up his sleeve that would have killed him. So we'll see how that plays out. The writers always say, what would Elmore do? That's the motto that they live by as far as the show. The creator, Elmore Leonard, passing away prior to season 5, and they've had to write the last 2 seasons without him. What's ominous is, in Elmore Leonard stories, a lot of times, the good guy doesn't always end up on top. A lot of times there is a criminal that gets over, and I'm thinking and I'm hoping the fact that Raylan has a daughter, I hope that's the scenario that spares him, because I think killing Raylan is very much in play, if not for that. I think it's just an unbearable downer for ending the show, because he has a daughter that's going to grow up without a father. If it ends that way, I'm hoping that's enough in the minds of the writers to be able to spare him. But we'll see how it goes. We got one more of these suckers left. Then I figure we'll probably do a post-season/series recap shortly thereafter. Hopefully get around at some point as well to doing a live together watching of Decoy. So we'll have to do that at some point as well. But it's been great covering it this season with you, my man. We got one more to go, and I know just like me, you can't wait.
It's going to be insane. Make sure everyone tunes in and then catches us right after.
Absolutely. We'll be here next week. We got one more of these left. For Jason Jones, I'm Rick Morris.
As we bring the show to a close, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all Clear Channel affiliates, TNT, TBS, USA, UPN, Deadspin.com, YouTube.com, YTMND.com, MySpace.com, various blogs, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, IamBoard.com, Billboard.com, Google.com, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic, NBA TV, NFL Network, Sports Time Ohio, Athlon Magazine, Comedy Central, Cartoon Network, The Boomerang Channel, QVC, BET, The Spice Channel, Steno Notebooks, Manwich, Papermate Office Supplies, waitresses, strippers, bartenders, garbage men, janitors, microwave popcorn, the writers of The Office, Scrubs, Entourage, My Name is Earl, Oz, Metalocalypse and the Boondocks, Aquafina, and The Periodic Table of Elements.